It's early morning in Bullitt County, Kentucky. The Dishon family goes about their usual routine, but lets 16-year-old daughter Jessica sleep in. When Jessica's mother comes back from grocery shopping, Jessica's bed is empty. Her car's parked out front, and her cell phone reads 911.
Shepherdsville as a community is a town where everyone knows everyone and everyone else's business. It's a very remote area with generation to generation to generation of the same families. In this small town, Jessica's murder became the biggest unsolved murder case in the state.
September 10th, 1989, it was just like any other morning. About 5:30, I would get up, be ready to go to work.
I walked in and out to her car, kissed her bye. Then I come in and got Bubby and Chris up. I told them, I said, get up, boys, I gotta go to work now. I looked in Jessica's bedroom. She was asleep. Then I went out and got my truck and I went to work.
The boys would catch the bus, and then about 6:30, I guess Jessica would be getting in her car headed to school. When I got home, I look around, and I'm hollering, Jessica, Jessica, trying to figure out where she's at.
Around 1:30, Edna called me and asked me if I had took Jessica to school that day. I said, no, I didn't take her to school. She said, well, is her car working? I said, I don't know why. She said, well, it's here in the driveway. I said, well, you got a key to it. Go out there and see if it'll start.
I opened the door. I knew something was wrong. Her purse, one shoe, everything that she would have had with her was in her vehicle.
I pulled in, and Edna said, Mike, there's something wrong. We found a cell phone with 911 dialed on it.
We was thinking that she maybe was trying to dial 911 for help, that she's in trouble. It was like I couldn't breathe, and I just knew something was wrong. I called the school, but they said she hadn't been to school that day. We went down to the sheriff's department. It was about 5 o'clock, and we told him what was going on.
He told me, he said, well, maybe she's a runaway. I said, no, she's not no runaway with one shoe on and one shoe off.
They told us to go home and come back that next morning. Like someone's got to help, you know. Our daughter's missing and no one wants to help.
So the day that Jessica Dishon was reported missing, state police should have been called in immediately. Her car is in the driveway. There is one shoe in the car. The other one is missing. A female's prized possession is her purse in the car. That should have been termed as a critical missing person.
We went back to the police station. It was pretty early. We told them, you all told us that she didn't come home. Come back down. We're down here. What are you all going to do?
After that, you know, they sent some cops up here. I figured they'd swarm this place, you know. But only 2 officers pulled up. He searched Jessica's car, no gloves, no nothing. If there were any fingerprints on the car before, he had messed them up because his hands was already all over the car too. Then they got back in the car and went back to Shepherdsville.
There's an abandoned car, a missing girl. Wouldn't you think there was something wrong and maybe you needed to take further action? Immediately, the car should have been impounded and the investigation should have started at that point because there's a girl that's still missing.
I don't think the police is doing their job. If they was doing their job, they would be here.
The Dishon family would get on TV and accuse my husband of not doing his job.
And that's understandable. They wanted to know when to find their daughter.
Of course, there's their child. You know, if that was my child, they couldn't do enough for me either.
We miss her. We just want her back. The only people that ever looked for Jessica was the people that lived here in the community. My brother Stanley, he said, well, if somebody was going to kill anybody and put them anywhere, they'd put them in the river bottom.
The river bottoms, it's a very spooky, eerie place. The first time I was down there, it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Anything that could happen down in Bullitt County, that's bad. It'll usually happen down in the river bottoms.
We wanted to search, even though it was rough on our family. Stanley, my brother, he got sick. And they had to take him home because he started vomiting. We all looked. We didn't find nothing out there. It was kind of hard to come back home when Jessica was still missing. Well, we couldn't sleep. And she was in there making the beds. I was doing the dishes. Chris goes out to feed the dogs. And Chris runs in the house. Said, Dad, I think I heard Jessica holler, help me. So I run in my bedroom, I got my gun. And out the door I went to find her. And if I caught somebody with her, whoever it was, I was going to kill her. I got my gun, and out the door I went. I went to kill. When we went out the door, my brother Stanley was pulling in the driveway. And he asked me, he said, what's going on? I said, Chris said he thought he heard Jessica holler, help. And he said, well, come on. We jumped the fence. We went up on the hills. We started looking around the pond. There's somebody burning a bunch of clothes up on the hill. And it was Bucky Brooks.
The properties of the Dishons and the Brooks family were adjacent to one another. And at that point in time, the relationship between those two families was boiling over.
When Jessica come up missing, Bucky Brooks kept harassing us. Bucky called us on the phone and breathed hard on the phone, and he hollered, please don't kill me, please don't kill me. Like he knew that maybe Jessica was pleading for her life. So that night, I asked Bucky if we could search their farm for Jessica. The Brookses, they was the only people that did not want their farm searched. It made me think that Bucky Brooks was involved in it. Everything that I've seen and heard, it leads back to him. I called the police department and tell them what's going on. The cops came. They come in the house and wanted to know what clothes that Jessica had on that night. She come up missing. And it was a pink pair of shorts.
We searched all the fields on Bucky's property. his barn, his garage, everything. When we was searching the barns, Bucky, he just was acting strange. The cadaver dogs picked up a scent in Bucky's fire pit.
They had 2 pairs of jersey gloves. The jersey gloves had decomposed body smell on them. But they wouldn't arrest Bucky Brooks. That kind of pissed me off. You know, I was mad about it.
The sheriff's office was not moving at a pace that the Dishon family thought that they should have. So Mike Dishon then called the FBI and said, I need your help.
The FBI said, the only time that we can come in here is if the sheriff department invite us or if one of the parents. And I said, well, I'm Mike Dishon. I'm Jessica's dad. I'm inviting you in. When the FBI arrived, I looked at the Bullitt County Sheriff Department and I said, look, all you little Keystone cops can go back to Shepherdsville now. I got the big dog for you.
The FBI looked at Jessica's room and they took some of her stuff and checked the fingerprints.
The FBI said, well, we need to take Jessica's car. I said, take it. You know, I said, anything in here you need to take, you take, because I've got nothing to hide. The FBI's called in the helicopters. They flew over to the pond, and they hovered over the pond up there. You know, then they brought guys in, and they walked the pond, you know, to make sure Jessica wasn't put in that pond.
The FBI started doing all the evidence collection, the search, everything. The search was done on the Brooks farm.
They showed me a picture that they found in the barn. It was Jessica.
It became very difficult for anyone involved in the investigation to just dismiss Bucky Brooks as a suspect.
Bucky Brooks appeared to be the prime suspect, but we still didn't know where Jessica Dishon was.
Jessica Dawn Dishon. That's her full name.
I was 17 when I had Jessica. It's a long day. Yeah, I was in labor like 12 hours.
When she was a little girl, I used to take her hunting. I used to put her up on my shoulders and take her back in the woods and go hunting with her, you know. And we had a good time.
A friend of mine, Karen Hobbs is her name, she was coming from Mount Washington in her vehicle. She cut through the river bottoms. She happened to glance over and there sat something up against a tree. And she went and called the police.
She says that she thinks she's found a body. The FBI forensic team arrived on the scene. The body was decomposed. It was completely unrecognizable. Part of her limb was gone, some of her fingers.
It was terrible. Well, I mean, my God, we had a murderer, a killer in the neighborhood.
Once the body had been found, the FBI forensic team had arrived on the scene. It appeared to be the body of Jessica Dishon.
Then right at dusty dark, I seen Paul Parsley come down the road with his lights on. Pulls up Gets out. Comes up and he says, "We found Jessica." I said, "Well, is she alive?" He said, "No, she's dead." Then Edna jumped up and said, "Now won't you tell me she's a damn runaway? We tried to tell y'all she did not run away." I told Edna, I said, "No, I can't." I said, "I can't go see Jessica like that."
I got there and feeling my knees. Couldn't really tell it was her from her face. But then I seen her butterfly tattoo on her side. And I knew that was her. And I was just devastated.
The medical examiner makes the determination the cause of death was strangulation.
And I've told her brothers, Bubby and Chris, Jessica wouldn't be back yet. She was dead. They started crying and they took it hard.
They told us that she had a broken jaw. Some of her fingers were cut off. She was alive for 3 days. She wasn't killed from day one. I was thinking for those 3 days, knowing that she didn't have food, she didn't have water, I wanted everybody to know that Sheriff's Department, they're not even doing their job right.
We're in a small department. Only had 2 detectives. They was working it every day and night. You see this little girl growing up. Excuse me. It's bad.
The FBI interviewed Bucky Brooks. Bucky was caught in several untruths. Bucky landed himself right in the middle of this investigation when he told the police that he had seen Jessica walking down the road that morning that she came up missing. When the FBI did a follow-up, he said, "Well, there's no way I could have seen Jessica because I was still having sex with my wife." And Irene gives information to the FBI. We didn't have sex that morning.
His statements repeatedly were proven to be inaccurate and false.
It don't take no rocket scientist to figure this out. Bucky Brooks got something to do with it.
And then the FBI did a polygraph exam.
The polygraph test result, although inadmissible in a courtroom, is a tool that prosecutors use to make decisions about a particular case.
He failed a polygraph. The FBI hand over all the information to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and there is a grand jury indictment brought against Bucky Brooks.
He earned the indictment, and he earned his way in front of a jury in the courtroom.
Reality kicks in when you finally see him face to face.
You don't know how bad I wanted to kill him.
Bucky Brooks was charged with murder and was facing the death penalty.
All rise for the session of Tom Law presiding.
The first day of the trial, the media was all there. I was feeling very confident that day. When Bucky came through the room, my heart just was racing really high.
Things started well for the prosecution.
We asked him what he would say if Jessica's body was found and his fingerprints were found on the body. And he responded, quotes, "If you find my fingerprints, I'll have to admit it."
The defense wanted to prove that the entire investigation was handled very, very bad. The body parts were left out to rot.
Across the top in red letters it says,
keep frozen.
And here it says,
keep frozen. Keep frozen.
Was it ever kept frozen?
No, sir.
Defense calls James Coulter.
James Coulter had a bad reputation in the town. He was running drugs. The defense attorneys thought that he could be responsible for the death of Jessica Dishon.
Did you see Jessica Dishon the day before she disappeared?
Yeah, I seen her at about 4 in the afternoon, Thursday.
And how did you know her?
I was pretty much her drug dealer, you know. I mean, I'm ashamed of that now, but that's how we was acquainted.
But the sheriff's office basically just says it could be nobody else other than Bucky Brooks.
He was the last one seen her alive.
Detective Charlie Mann was hounded on the witness stand repeatedly. Why did you charge my client? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? He finally just belts out.
They failed a polygraph, I think, the issue to him.
Jeff.
The whole premise behind a polygraph exam is to get a confession. That's it. Only that confession is admissible in court, as long as the word polygraph never comes up in your testimony.
The court ruled that there was a mistrial, and the trial itself stopped.
It's over. The jury is dismissed. Everyone leaves the courtroom.
I give a judge cussing.
Nobody in this courtroom can stand up and tell me and her that they know how we feel when somebody come in our yard and took our 17-year-old daughter out of our yard.
Edna started crying.
Edna, your thoughts? Excuse us.
Really wasn't much we could do.
It's up to the Commonwealth whether or not they're going to bring charges against that man again.
A mistrial does not mean the defendant is not guilty. Bucky Brooks could be tried again if they found more evidence.
How does it feel?
Good.
Feels good?
Yep.
They'd never tried to find nothing else on Bucky or nothing. You know, that was it.
It's a waiting game. We're still waiting. You know, when is it ever someone gonna be arrested?
It was like no one ever had any plan of charging anybody with this crime.
I didn't get justice for Jessica.
The Commonwealth attorney turns the evidence back over to the family and goes, here you go, you can have it all. Which is pretty indicative that Bucky's never going to get charged anymore, and neither is anybody else. The Jessica Dishon case just goes cold.
With Bucky's case declared a mistrial, the Dishons' last hope for justice disappears, leaving Edna and Mike alone to deal with their anger and their grief.
Went to her room just about every day and looked at her pictures and told her that I loved her and knows that we're not giving up on her, and kind of made me feel better knowing that I still have some type of contact with her.
I didn't change that room since Jessica got missing. People tell me a lot of times when somebody loses a family, it pulls them apart, you know.
Just one thing after another.
She come told me she wanted a divorce. I said, okay.
I couldn't take it anymore.
I lost my kid. I lost my wife, too, you know. We still don't talk.
The sheriff's office wanted to hire me to look at their old murder cases, and that was my passion. Jessica Dishon's case, because of the enormity of that case, became the first. Being the new person makes the case doubly hard. It's not just being the new person either, it was a woman. There was many people probably intimidated by me, but I really didn't care. I was there to do a job. When I started the investigation, I had such little paper information there in the sheriff's office. Mostly it was just loose leaf paper thrown in boxes, napkins, sticky notes. No phone numbers of individuals that they had interviewed, no birth dates, no addresses, no nothing. Soon after that, I went to Mike Dishon's home and sat down and met with Mike and Bubby just to tell them that I was going to reopen the case.
She was a very nice lady. I think she knew what she was doing, you know, better than some of these hicks that we had out here.
In Jessica's room, Bubby points me to the closet, and he turns around and he hands me a pink with flowers hat box. Inside there was her shoe, her billfold, her cell phone, all the evidence that was left in the car. I left with it, brought it back to the office, and re-entered it into evidence. During the time that Bucky was on trial, they had also hired private investigators to assist in the defense case, so I was wanting to know all the information that they had gained. So I borrowed a box truck, and I went to the defense attorney's office and obtained all of the boxes with the case file information from the trial of Bucky Brooks and hauled them all back to the sheriff's office. The defense had a true investigation going, a lot better than I think the prosecution did. Digging through the files, lo and behold, but what do I find? New information regarding Bucky Brooks. It was an enormous break in the Jessica Dishon murder case. I found Bucky's mental evaluation. It stated that he had an IQ of 61. Bucky Brooks never should have been given a polygraph exam with that low of IQ. There's no way they can understand the questions, let alone understand how they're answered. I wasn't 100% sure Bucky was innocent. But if Bucky didn't do it, I needed to prove who did. Right away, it was very clear that the defense believed that there were suspects other than Bucky Brooks. The defense had a lot of circumstantial evidence involving the drug-dealing James Coulter.
During the trial against Bucky Brooks, Coulter became important to the defense. This is called the alternate perpetrator theory. That Coulter had committed the crime of kidnapping and murder. However, because of the mistrial, the defense never presented a case.
But no one thought to follow up after the trial. Coulter was in jail. So I go down, pay him a visit. The morning that Jessica disappeared, he told me he was in a hotel with a female and did not check out until sometime the next day. I asked him if he had seen anybody that morning, and he said the maintenance guy had came by. I went to the hotel, but the hotel, of course, did not have any records back that far at all. As I'm leaving, I find out the same maintenance guy, he was still working there. He had seen the trial, and he remembers it. James Coulter and his girlfriend, he clearly remembered that they checked out around noon. That verified the alibi. After all that time, there was not one single piece of evidence to point in a direction of anyone. I felt just a deep sadness. Will we ever solve it? I get a call from a detective that I used to work with who had some information regarding the Dishon case. The present informant had told him he knew who killed Jessica Dishon. I had some apprehensions because the informants were shaky at best. But I knew that maybe we were onto something. And the informant at the penitentiary had told me about an inmate who was placed in the same cell with him. Both of them had been charged for having sexual relations with children. and the inmate said he had committed the murder against Jessica Dishon. In your best recollection, tell me what you remember the suspect telling you in regards to the Jessica Dishon murder.
He stated that he had Jessica for a couple of days, and then he took her life. The reason he did any mutilation to her, he was trying to make it look like some drug dealers or a cartel done that to her.
That particular inmate had no independent knowledge of the facts that he was relating to Detective Hunt, other than to have listened to someone who was present when she was killed.
Why was he pissed off again?
She was having a relationship with a boy her own age, someone that she had found that she liked. He kept calling that boy a little bastard and that little bitch and calling her names.
And that's when he told me who killed Jessica Dishon. I had a conversation with an inmate. He says that he knows who killed Jessica Dishon. And that's when he told me Jessica's uncle, Stanley Dishon, committed the murder. Stanley Dishon was Mike's brother. On the first morning of the search, when they got within a mile of where the body was, Stanley became physically ill.
He stated that he almost had his brother down by the body at one point. So he just quit looking for her, just quit looking for her.
The informant said Stanley had tortured her in a barn that was close by to where the body was dumped, and it was some location of where the kids used to party at.
And he stated that some of her personal belongings is under a tree that's fallen in that area.
I needed to find one piece of physical evidence to be able to corroborate all this information. So we go down to the river bottoms and start digging. And it rains, and it rains. And we keep digging, and we keep looking, and we keep digging. Bubby, Jessica's brother, stays to help me. I've done dug at least 175 holes down here. And after about 6 or 7 hours, we're all soaking wet. We decide, let's just forget it. Let's tear down the crib. We are never going to find the shoe. Bubby and I get in the car. So as Bubby and I are driving, he goes, that's where all they used to go party at. And I stopped dead in the middle of the road. Because clearly there was a building and a barn there. We walk in the first building. It's dark. Half of the roof is missing, so that was only part of the light that we had. And I see a piece of material sticking out from mud and sand and all kinds of junk just thrown on top of it. So I start pulling it out. And I said, that looks strangely like your sister's comforter that's on her bed. I said, what are the chances it's the same pattern? We drive as fast as we can with the sheet in the car directly back to his house because her room hasn't changed since the murder. Pull the comforter back, pull the blanket back, and guess what's not there? The fitted sheet. Nothing but the mattress. It was no shit. It wasn't an oh my God moment, you know? I think the informant was telling the truth. I feel sure now that Stanley Dishon had murdered his niece. Stanley Dishon had been raping and sodomizing Jessica Dishon for years. The morning that she came up missing, Stanley went to the Dishons. He knew what time Mike and Edna would leave for work. He knew what time that Chris and Bubby were going to be getting on the school bus. An argument ensued. Jessica had a new boyfriend. Jessica apparently was threatening Stanley if he didn't leave her alone, then she was going to tell the boyfriend everything that he had done to her when she was a little girl. Stanley lost his mind because he knew that Mike Dishon would kill him. He knocked her out. He had broke her jaw. And he got her to a barn. She was kept for 3 days and tortured. And that's when he strangled her.
I was upset, yeah. I was devastated. How could someone that, that's lived with you and you've taken care of, how could they do that?
Lynn Hunt told me, she said, I'm going to indict your brother. I said, well, if he done it, I want the death penalty.
Lynn Hunt began to talk to the family members about Stanley.
We've discovered more victims through the investigation. One victim that we met with, I said, did something happen between you and Stanley Dishon? And she stood up and just passed out. He had started raping her from the time she was 6 years old, with threats of violence, threats of guns. It ended up being a total of 3 other family members.
He was not only on the hook for murder and kidnapping, but for multiple counts of rape with several different victims.
It would have been very difficult for victims to have to get up there and tell a courtroom full of strangers that Stanley Dishon raped them. For that reason, we chose to just take the plea deal and be done.
Mike and Edna now have the truth of what happened to Jessica. But detectives find a final piece of information that will haunt the Dishons forever.
When I went through the defense files, I pull out the 7th box, and inside the box was a letter from a second informant, 2002. The letter said, I am an inmate, and I was in the cell with Stanley Dishon where he admitted he killed his niece, and he dumped the body in the river bottoms.
He not only confessed, but he had done it back in 2002. It's disgusting to think that it had been there for so long.
The Commonwealth and the Sheriff's Office all had a copy of this letter, and basically they didn't do anything with it. The shocking thing about this case was not that Stanley Dishon had murdered his niece. The shocking thing about this case was that they knew this back in 2002 when they had Bucky Brooks on trial and nobody did a thing about it.
I didn't believe it. He was my brother. I gave him a home. I fed him, got him a job. It's hatred, you know what I'm saying? of somebody taking your 17-year-old kid and killing her and raping her.
Sitting in prison is not justice. I have to work every day to pay taxes for him to be able to stay in prison after what he did to my Jessica. That's not justice.
Stanley will be 70-some years old when he gets out, and I'll be waiting for him.
August 1st, 1966, began like an ordinary summer day in Austin, Texas. Students moved through the grounds of the University of Texas. People walked along the streets surrounding the campus. Cars passed beneath the bright Texas sky. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest that the day would become one of the darkest moments in the history of the city. High above the university, however, a man was preparing to turn an ordinary place into the center of a catastrophe. His name was Charles Joseph Whitman. By the time the first shots were fired, Whitman had already killed 2 people who were closest to him. His mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, was dead. His wife, Catherine Kathy Leisner Whitman, was dead. The violence that would soon unfold across the university campus was not the beginning of what he had done. It was the continuation of a sequence of deliberate acts that had begun inside 2 private homes, behind closed doors, before the public understood that anything was wrong. That morning, Whitman carried weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies toward the University of Texas Tower. He was not simply walking into the university as a student. He was preparing for an attack. The tower gave him something the people below did not have: height, distance, and a wide view over the surrounding area. From the observation level, the campus and nearby streets spread out beneath him. Students and pedestrians appeared small against the landscape of Austin. To those on the ground, the tower was part of the university itself, a familiar landmark. To Whitman, it became a position from which he could fire upon people who had no idea what was coming. At approximately 11:48 that morning, the first shots rang out. For the people below, there was no warning that made sense. At first, some did not understand what they were hearing. The sound of gunfire was unfamiliar in a place where people expected lectures, conversations, footsteps, and the ordinary movement of university life. Then people began to realize that someone was firing from above. The ordinary rhythm of the campus broke apart. Students ran. People searched for places where they could hide. Some dropped to the ground. Others tried to help those who had been wounded. Cars were abandoned as people attempted to escape from exposed areas. Emergency calls began reporting shootings from different locations around the campus and surrounding streets. The danger seemed to come from somewhere that was difficult to reach and even more difficult to understand. Whitman was high above the ground, protected by the structure of the tower. Police officers below had to determine where the shots were coming from and how they could reach the shooter. Every attempt to move toward the tower carried another danger. Whitman could continue firing while those trying to stop him remained exposed. For nearly 96 minutes, Austin lived under the threat of a gunman positioned above the city. The passage of time during those 96 minutes was measured not by ordinary routines, but by gunfire, emergency calls, movement, and fear. The people trapped below did not know how long the attack would continue. They did not know whether the next shot would strike them, someone beside them, or someone several streets away. They could not know what had brought the gunman to the tower, and they could not know when the violence would end. Whitman fired approximately 150 rounds during the attack. The number itself is difficult to comprehend, but the figures tell only part of the story. Behind every report of a wounded person was an individual whose ordinary day had suddenly become a struggle to survive. Behind every death was a family that would never again receive that person at home. The university campus, a place associated with education and daily life, had become the setting for an event that would remain in American history. While police worked to reach the tower, some armed civilians also attempted to help. From the ground, people searched for positions from which they could fire back. The situation was chaotic. Whitman's height gave him an enormous advantage, while those attempting to stop him had to work from below and around the structure of the building. Inside the tower, police officers began moving upward. They did not know exactly where Whitman was positioned. They did not know how much ammunition he still had. They did not know whether approaching the observation area would expose them to direct fire. Yet they continued toward him. Among the officers who ultimately reached the observation level were Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy. Their actions would bring the attack to an end. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, Martinez and McCoy confronted Whitman and shot him. The gunfire from the tower finally stopped. But silence did not mean the end of the tragedy. By then, people had been killed and wounded across the campus and surrounding area. Whitman's mother and wife were already dead, victims of violence that had taken place before the public attack began. 16 people were ultimately counted as having died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, while another wounded victim later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total to 17 deaths. 31 people were wounded. The numbers would become part of the historical record, but numbers cannot fully describe what happened that day. The victims were not statistics. They were people who had begun August 1st expecting an ordinary day. They had no reason to believe that a distant figure above them had decided that their lives would be interrupted by violence. And that is where the story of Charles Whitman becomes more difficult to understand. Whitman was not a stranger who had appeared suddenly from nowhere. He had been a husband. He had been a son. He had been a student at the University of Texas. He had served in the United States Marine Corps and had received military firearms training. From the outside, his life contained experiences that did not automatically point toward the massacre that would eventually define his name. Yet in the months before August 1st, his life had become increasingly unstable. He faced difficulties involving his studies, finances, marriage, and relationship with his father. People who knew him later described changes in his mood and behavior. Whitman had also sought psychological assistance. In a written note made before the killings, he described disturbing thoughts and episodes of anger that he did not fully understand himself. Those details matter because the attack was not simply an event that began when Whitman reached the tower. The violence had a history. On the night of July 31st, Whitman went to his mother's apartment in Austin. There, he killed Margaret Elizabeth Whitman. He then returned to the home he shared with Kathy. His wife was also killed. Afterward, Whitman left notes expressing that he loved his mother and his wife, while also describing the psychological difficulties he believed he was experiencing. The contradiction is disturbing. A man could write about love for the people closest to him and, almost at the same time, commit acts that permanently destroyed those lives. The notes became important to investigators because they offered a glimpse into Whitman's thoughts before the attack, but they did not provide a simple explanation for what happened. The next morning, he carried his weapons and supplies to the university. Then he went upward. The tower stood above Austin, visible across the surrounding area. From that height, Whitman looked down upon a world continuing its normal routines. People below were walking, driving, studying, and living their lives without knowing that a deadly attack was about to begin. At 11:48, everything changed. The first shots transformed uncertainty into terror. For those on the ground, the most frightening question was not only who was shooting. It was where the next shot would come from and when it would stop. Police officers faced the impossible task of locating and reaching a shooter who had chosen a position designed to make him difficult to approach. Civilians tried to protect themselves and one another. Some armed citizens attempted to return fire. Above them, Whitman remained in the tower. The attack continued. Nearly 96 minutes later, it was over. But the questions created by those 96 minutes would remain for decades. Why had Whitman killed his mother and wife before going to the university? Why had he gathered weapons, ammunition, food, and water? What did his notes reveal about his state of mind? And after his death, why did investigators discover a brain tumor that would become one of the most controversial details surrounding the case? The tumor could not provide a complete answer. There was no simple medical explanation that could erase the choices Whitman had made or reduce the suffering of the people he killed. It became one factor in a much larger and unresolved discussion about his behavior. What can be established is simpler and more haunting. On August 1st, 1966, Charles Whitman climbed the University of Texas Tower carrying the means to commit an attack. Below him were people who had done nothing to provoke him and who had no reason to expect violence. By the time police officers reached him, lives had already been shattered. The tower would remain standing after Whitman was gone. The university would continue. Austin would heal as much as a city can heal after a tragedy of that magnitude. But for the victims and their families, August 1st would never become just another date. It would remain the day an ordinary summer morning became a massacre, the day a familiar landmark became the center of terror, and the day Charles Whitman's private crisis became a public tragedy that would be remembered across the United States for generations. To understand how that morning became possible, however, it is necessary to step away from the tower and look backward. Before the gunfire, before the emergency calls, before the police climbed toward the observation level, there was a man whose life had already begun to unravel. And before the first victim on the university grounds was struck, 2 members of Whitman's own family had already lost their lives. That is where the story truly begins. To understand what happened on August 1st, 1966, it is necessary to look beyond the tower and beyond the final 96 minutes of violence. The massacre did not emerge from a single moment. Before Charles Whitman arrived at the University of Texas, there was a personal history behind him, a family history, a marriage, a military background, and a period of increasing instability that had become visible in the months leading up to the killings. None of those circumstances can excuse what he eventually did. They can, however, help establish the setting in which the tragedy developed. Charles Joseph Whitman was born in 1941 in Lake Worth, Florida. His childhood took place within a family environment described as demanding and pressured. His father was strict, and the relationship between father and son would later become an important part of the background surrounding Whitman's life. From an early age, Whitman experienced expectations and pressures that shaped his relationship with his family. Yet there was nothing about his childhood that could have clearly predicted the events of August 1966. As a young man, Whitman joined the United States Marine Corps. His military service gave him formal training with firearms, an experience that would later become tragically relevant. After leaving the military, he continued his education and eventually attended the University of Texas in Austin. To many people around him, he was not an obvious threat. He was a student, a husband, and a member of ordinary society. His life contained difficulties, but difficulties alone did not make him appear capable of the violence that would eventually take place. Whitman married Kathy Leisner Whitman. Kathy was a young student he had met in Austin, and their marriage became one of the central relationships in his life. From the information available about the period before the killings, Whitman's marriage was not free from problems. His personal circumstances were becoming increasingly difficult. He faced trouble with his studies, financial pressures, and growing tension within his family relationships. His relationship with his father had also deteriorated. These pressures did not appear in isolation. They accumulated over time. People who knew Whitman later described changes in his mood and behavior. He experienced episodes of anger and disturbing thoughts. Most importantly, he had become aware that something was wrong with him. He sought psychological assistance, suggesting that he was not entirely unaware of the changes taking place inside his own mind. In a written note made before the killings, Whitman described the strange thoughts and anger he had been experiencing and expressed confusion about what was happening to him. That detail is significant because it shows that the warning signs were not entirely invisible. Whitman himself had recognized that he was experiencing disturbing changes. But recognition is not the same as prevention. There was no simple diagnosis, intervention, or event that stopped what followed. The people who would become victims of the massacre could not have known any of this. They were students, pedestrians, and ordinary members of the Austin community. They were living their lives on a summer morning when the tower above them became the source of an attack. Their stories were suddenly divided into 2 parts: the lives they had lived before August 1st and the consequences that followed. The tragedy also included victims who were closest to Whitman. On the night of July 31st, before the public attack, Whitman went to the apartment of his mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman. There, he killed her. He then returned to the home he shared with his wife, Kathy, and killed her as well. These killings are essential to understanding the sequence of events because the tower attack was not an isolated act. By the time Whitman entered the university campus the following morning, 2 people had already died at his hands. His mother and his wife were not strangers. They were members of his immediate family. The violence against them occurred in private, away from the crowds that would later witness the public attack. Whitman subsequently left notes that expressed his love for both women while also describing the psychological difficulties he believed he was experiencing. The contradiction between those words and his actions would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The notes did not transform the killings into something understandable or acceptable. They became evidence of Whitman's state of mind and part of the material investigators examined as they attempted to reconstruct the final hours of his life. After killing his mother and wife, Whitman began preparing for the next stage. He gathered weapons and ammunition, along with food, water, and other supplies. The presence of these supplies suggested that he was preparing to remain in the tower for a period of time. His actions showed planning rather than a completely spontaneous act. He did not simply arrive at the university and suddenly decide to attack. He had already committed 2 murders, gathered equipment, and moved toward a location that would provide him with a wide view of the surrounding area. The University of Texas Tower was a familiar landmark in Austin. Its height made it visible across much of the surrounding area, and the observation level provided an elevated position over the campus and nearby streets. On an ordinary day, the tower represented the university itself. On August 1st, it became the setting for one of the most devastating attacks in American history. Before Whitman reached it, however, the people below were simply going about their routines. Students moved through the campus. Pedestrians traveled along nearby streets. Cars passed through the surrounding area. There was no reason for them to imagine that someone above them was preparing to fire upon them. That absence of warning is central to the human dimension of the tragedy. The victims did not choose to participate in the violence. They did not know Whitman. They could not understand his personal struggles, his family conflicts, or the disturbing thoughts he had described. They were simply present when the attack began. When the first shots were fired at approximately 11:48 in the morning, the people on the ground had to react without understanding the full situation. Some initially did not recognize the sound as gunfire. Once the danger became clear, panic spread through the campus and surrounding streets. People searched for cover.
Some dropped to the ground.
Others tried to help wounded people reach safety. Vehicles were abandoned as drivers and passengers attempted to escape exposed areas. Emergency calls began describing people being shot from above. For police officers, the situation presented an extraordinary challenge. They had to determine the shooter's position while also protecting people on the ground. Whitman's elevated position made direct access difficult. Officers could not simply walk toward him across open ground without exposing themselves to danger. Some armed civilians also attempted to assist. The response developed under circumstances for which the city had little precedent. People on the ground looked upward toward the tower, trying to identify the source of the gunfire. Police and civilians searched for positions from which they could return fire. Others concentrated on helping those who had been wounded. The scene was not controlled or orderly. It was a rapidly changing emergency in which every person had limited information. The victims experienced that uncertainty differently. For someone trapped in an exposed area, the threat could seem almost invisible. The shooter was high above, while the people below had little ability to know exactly where he was aiming. A person could hear shots without knowing whether they were the intended target. Another might see someone nearby suddenly fall. Others could only run and hope that distance would place them beyond danger. This is why the statistics alone cannot capture the experience of the day. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, while another wounded victim later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total to 17. 31 people were wounded. Each number represented an individual life interrupted by violence and a family left to deal with the consequences. For the families of Margaret Whitman and Kathy Whitman, the tragedy had already begun before the public attack. Their deaths meant that the massacre included 2 victims whose connection to the killer was deeply personal. For the other victims, the connection was different. They were members of a community who happened to be in the wrong place when violence came from above. The contrast between these groups makes the case especially disturbing. Whitman's private life and public attack became connected through a sequence of decisions that moved from his family to the university. Yet the people he encountered in Austin did not share responsibility for his problems. Whatever pressures he experienced, whatever anger he felt, and whatever psychological difficulties troubled him, the consequences were imposed upon people who had not chosen them. After the attack, investigators would study the evidence left behind by Whitman. They would examine his notes, his weapons, the supplies he carried, and the circumstances surrounding the deaths of his mother and wife. They would also learn about his psychological concerns and eventually discover a brain tumor during the autopsy. That discovery would create another layer of controversy. But before questions about the tumor could dominate discussion, investigators had to reconstruct what had happened during the hours before the shooting. They had to move backward through the sequence of events, beginning with the deaths inside Whitman's family and ending with his arrival at the tower. The story of August 1st, therefore, cannot be understood solely from the moment the first shot was fired. The victims on the ground were the final part of a chain that had begun much earlier. And as investigators started following that chain, the private world of Charles Whitman began to reveal the warning signs, preparations, and decisions that had brought him to the top of the University of Texas Tower. The morning of August 1st, 1966, carried the quiet appearance of an ordinary summer day in Austin. The University of Texas campus was active with students and pedestrians, while traffic moved through the streets around it. Nothing about the morning suggested that the university would soon become the scene of a prolonged attack. But Charles Whitman had already completed the most private part of his violence. His mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, and his wife, Catherine Kathy Leisner Whitman, were dead. He had left behind notes describing his feelings and the psychological difficulties he believed he was experiencing. He had gathered weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies. Now he was moving toward the next stage. Whitman entered the University of Texas, carrying the equipment he had prepared. The university tower stood above the surrounding campus, a familiar landmark that offered a broad view of Austin. Its height made it difficult for anyone on the ground to approach a person positioned above. Whitman used the tower's elevator to reach the upper level and then moved into the observation area. From there, he had a commanding view over the campus and nearby streets. For the people below, nothing had changed yet. Students continued moving through the university grounds. Pedestrians continued along the streets. Cars passed through the surrounding area. People were engaged in the ordinary activities of a summer day, unaware that someone above them had prepared to attack. Then, at approximately 11:48 in the morning, the first shots were fired. At first, confusion was almost as important as fear. People did not immediately understand what the sound meant. A university campus was not a place where gunfire was expected. Some people could not identify the source, while others began to realize that the shots were coming from the tower. Once that realization spread, the atmosphere changed completely. People began running for cover. Some dropped to the ground. Others searched for buildings, walls, vehicles, or other places that could provide protection. Those who saw wounded people attempted to help them. Drivers abandoned vehicles when remaining in the open became too dangerous. The campus and nearby streets quickly became a landscape of confusion, fear, and desperate movement. The greatest problem was the position of the shooter. Whitman was high above the ground, surrounded by the structure of the tower. The people below could see the tower, but seeing the building was not the same as reaching the person inside it. Police officers had to determine exactly where the gunfire was coming from and find a way to approach the observation level without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Emergency calls began reporting people being shot in different locations. The reports reflected the wide area affected by Whitman's position. From the tower, he could fire toward people in the university grounds and surrounding streets. Those on the ground had little warning and even less certainty about where the next shot might strike. The attack continued. Whitman fired approximately 150 rounds during the roughly 96-minute assault. The duration itself made the situation more terrifying. This was not a brief burst of violence followed immediately by an arrest. For more than an hour, People in Austin lived with the knowledge that a gunman remained above them and could continue firing. The victims had almost no control over the situation. Some were caught in open areas. Others tried to stay behind whatever protection they could find. People helped one another when possible, but every movement carried uncertainty. A person attempting to reach an injured victim could potentially expose himself or herself to the same danger. The ordinary instinct to help someone in distress now had to compete with the instinct to survive. Police officers faced an equally difficult calculation. They needed to stop Whitman, but reaching him required moving through a dangerous environment. The tower structure gave him an advantage. Officers below could attempt to return fire, but shooting upward at a distant and partially protected target was not an easy way to end the attack. Some armed civilians also became involved. As the gunfire continued, people with firearms attempted to help confront the shooter from the ground. Their actions reflected the extraordinary circumstances of the day. Austin had suddenly become a place where police officers and civilians were trying to stop a gunman positioned high above a university campus. The response was developing in real time. There was no simple way to know exactly what Whitman intended to do next. He had brought food and water with him, along with his weapons and ammunition, suggesting that he had prepared to remain in position. The supplies added another disturbing dimension to the attack. He had not merely arrived at the tower without preparation. He had equipped himself for a prolonged confrontation. Inside the tower, officers began working toward the upper level. Every step brought them closer to the source of the gunfire, but also closer to the man responsible for it. They did not know exactly where Whitman was positioned. They did not know how much ammunition remained. They could not assume that the danger would end simply because they had entered the building. Meanwhile, the people outside continued trying to survive. The attack affected more than the university grounds. The surrounding streets were also exposed to gunfire. People who had never entered the campus could suddenly find themselves in danger. The height of the tower allowed Whitman to reach areas beyond the immediate university grounds, expanding the sense that the entire surrounding area had become vulnerable. The distinction between campus and city seemed to disappear. Austin residents who had begun the day expecting nothing unusual were now watching the university tower, listening for gunfire, and trying to understand what was happening. Emergency services were dealing with wounded people while officers focused on the source of the attack. The exact number of victims would become clearer later, but during those 96 minutes, the people involved did not have the benefit of historical statistics. They knew only what they could see and hear in the moment. Someone was shooting from the tower. People were being wounded. The shooter had not been stopped. The uncertainty made every minute significant. At some point during the response, the officers attempting to reach Whitman moved closer to the observation area. Among them were Austin police officers Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy. Their eventual approach would become the decisive moment of the incident. Martinez and McCoy continued toward Whitman's position. The danger was still present. Whitman remained armed, and the tower still offered him protection and height. Yet the officers were able to reach the observation level and confront him. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, the confrontation ended with Whitman's death. Martinez and McCoy shot him. The gunfire from the tower stopped. For the first time since approximately 11:48 that morning, people in Austin no longer faced the immediate threat of shots coming from above. The attack that had lasted around 96 minutes was over. But the end of the shooting did not erase what had happened. Police entering the area around Whitman's position found the evidence of preparation. He had brought a substantial quantity of equipment with him. Weapons and ammunition were present, along with food, water, and other supplies. The scene indicated that he had expected to remain in the tower rather than leave quickly. Investigators also had the notes Whitman had left before the attack. Those notes became important because they offered a window into his thoughts during the period immediately preceding the killings. He had described psychological difficulties and disturbing experiences, including anger and thoughts that he did not fully understand. He had also written about his mother and wife in terms that expressed affection. The evidence created a disturbing contradiction. Whitman had killed the two people he claimed to love, then gone to the university and attacked people he did not know. The notes could help investigators understand the sequence, but they could not undo the consequences. When the immediate scene was brought under control, the scale of the tragedy became clearer. 16 people had died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, including Margaret and Kathy, while 31 others had been wounded. Another victim who survived the shooting later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited death toll to 17. The numbers would become part of the history of the case, but the scene itself was defined by individual losses. Every person who died had a separate life and a separate family. Every wounded survivor carried the consequences beyond the day itself. For Austin, the tower had become permanently associated with the attack. For the families of the victims, the end of the shooting did not mean the end of their suffering. The immediate danger had disappeared, but grief remained. The people who had gone to the university that morning expecting an ordinary day would never experience August 1st in the same way again. The death of Whitman also meant that there would be no conventional criminal trial. He would not stand before a judge. He would not be questioned in court. He would not provide testimony explaining his decisions. Instead, investigators would have to reconstruct the case through physical evidence, written notes, witness accounts, and the circumstances surrounding the killings. They would have to determine what happened before Whitman reached the tower and what his actions revealed about his intentions. That investigation would begin with the most obvious facts. Whitman had killed his mother. He had killed his wife. He had gathered weapons and supplies. He had gone to the University of Texas Tower. He had fired approximately 150 rounds at people below. And he had remained there until police officers reached him. But one discovery made after his death would complicate the attempt to understand his behavior. During the autopsy, doctors found a brain tumor known as an astrocytoma. The discovery raised questions that could not be answered simply. Could a tumor have influenced Whitman's emotions or behavior? Could it have contributed to the changes people had noticed before the massacre? Or was it only one part of a much larger combination of personal and psychological circumstances? The tumor would become one of the most debated elements of a case. Yet the facts of the incident remained clear. On August 1, 1966, Charles Whitman climbed the University of Texas Tower and opened fire on people below. For approximately 96 minutes, the people of Austin faced a gunman they could not easily reach. Police officers and armed civilians attempted to respond. Eventually, Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy reached Whitman's position and ended the attack. The tower became quiet again. The city began to count its dead and wounded. And investigators began moving backward through the evidence, trying to understand how a former Marine, university student, husband, and son had reached the point where violence against his own family became the beginning of a public massacre. The next stage of the story would take investigators away from the tower and into the evidence Whitman had left behind, where the sequence of his final hours could begin to emerge with greater clarity. Once Charles Whitman was dead, the immediate danger at the University of Texas Tower had ended, but the investigation had only begun. Police officers no longer had to determine how to stop a gunman above the campus.
Their task had changed.
They now had to reconstruct what had happened, establish the sequence of Whitman's actions, examine the evidence he had left behind, and understand how the events of August 1st were connected to the deaths that had occurred before the public attack. The investigation began with the tower. Whitman's position contained evidence that could help explain how he had prepared for the assault. He had brought weapons and ammunition, but his preparations went beyond firearms. Food, water, and other supplies were also present. Those items were important because they suggested that Whitman had expected the situation to continue for some time. The attack had not been a moment of sudden confusion in which he found himself trapped without preparation. He had equipped himself before entering the tower. Investigators also had to consider the physical circumstances of the shooting. Whitman had chosen a high position that provided a wide view over the university grounds and nearby streets. His elevation made it difficult for people on the ground to approach him and allowed him to fire over a broad area. The approximately 96-minute duration of the attack, combined with the estimated 150 rounds fired, demonstrated the scale of the violence. But the tower could not explain everything. To understand the attack, investigators had to go backward. They needed to examine what Whitman had done before arriving at the university. That meant looking at the deaths of his mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, and his wife, Catherine Kathy Leisner Whitman. Those two killings changed the understanding of the case. The public attack had not been the first violence committed by Whitman that day. His mother and wife had already been killed before he entered the university. Their deaths showed that the tragedy had begun in private before it became visible to Austin. Investigators examined the notes Whitman had left behind. These writings were among the most important pieces of information available for reconstructing his state of mind. In them, Whitman described his feelings toward his mother and wife and expressed that he loved them. At the same time, he wrote about psychological difficulties, anger, and disturbing thoughts that he did not fully understand. The notes presented investigators with a deeply disturbing contradiction. Whitman had described affection for the people he had killed, yet he had deliberately taken their lives. He had then continued preparing for an attack on strangers. The writings could provide information about what he believed was happening inside his mind, but they could not provide a complete explanation for his actions. Investigators also had information about Whitman's life before the killings. He had served in the United States Marine Corps and had received military firearms training. He had later attended the University of Texas. He was married. He had faced problems with his studies and finances, and his relationship with his father had become increasingly strained. People who knew him had noticed changes in his mood and behavior. Perhaps most significant was the fact that Whitman had sought psychological assistance. This detail mattered because it demonstrated that his difficulties had not been entirely invisible. Whitman had experienced thoughts and feelings that disturbed him enough to seek help. He had described episodes of anger and other troubling experiences. Yet the existence of these warning signs did not provide investigators with a single answer explaining why he eventually committed murder. The investigation, therefore, had to remain grounded in what could actually be established. Whitman had experienced personal and psychological problems. He had killed his mother. He had killed his wife. He had gathered weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies. He had gone to the university tower. He had fired approximately 150 rounds. And he had continued the attack until police officers reached him. These facts formed the central sequence of the case. Another question emerged from the investigation. What had Whitman intended when he prepared the supplies? The presence of food and water suggested that he may have expected to remain in the tower for an extended period. The evidence did not support the idea that he had simply lost control for a few minutes. His preparation indicated planning. That distinction was important. A spontaneous act might be reconstructed around a single sudden event. Whitman's actions were different. The sequence stretched from the killings of his mother and wife through the collection of equipment and the movement to the university. The tower attack was the final and most public stage of that sequence. The police response also became part of the investigation. Officers had been forced to deal with a situation in which the shooter occupied an elevated and protected position. People on the ground could attempt to return fire, but reaching the shooter required entering the tower and moving toward the observation level. Armed civilians also attempted to help. Eventually, Austin police officers Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy reached Whitman's position. Their confrontation with him ended the attack at approximately 1:24 in the afternoon. The investigation then shifted from stopping the threat to documenting the evidence. The bodies of the victims had to be accounted for. The wounded had to be identified and treated. The locations connected to the killings had to be examined. Whitman's belongings had to be studied. His notes had to be preserved and interpreted. Investigators needed to connect the private killings with the public attack and establish a coherent chronology. The numbers began to take shape. 16 people had died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, while 31 were wounded. A wounded victim later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total number of deaths to 17. These figures were essential for the historical record, but the investigation was not simply an exercise in counting. Each death represented a separate person and a separate family. Each injury represented consequences that extended beyond the moment of the shooting. As investigators continued examining Whitman's life, the discovery made during his autopsy introduced another major question. Doctors found a brain tumor in Whitman's brain. The tumor, identified as an astrocytoma, immediately attracted attention because of its location and the broader questions surrounding Whitman's behavior. The discovery raised the possibility that a physical condition might have influenced his emotional state or behavior. But this was not a straightforward explanation. There was no universal agreement that the tumor caused Whitman's actions. A brain tumor could become an important medical factor to examine without becoming a complete explanation for a deliberate sequence of murders. His behavior also had to be considered in the context of his personal difficulties, his psychological complaints, his family relationships, and the planning that preceded the attack. The tumor therefore became a point of controversy rather than a final answer. Some interpretations gave it considerable importance. Others were more cautious. The available facts did not justify reducing the entire tragedy to one medical discovery. This distinction was important because explanations can sometimes become substitutes for understanding. Saying that a tumor caused the massacre would suggest a certainty that the evidence did not establish. The investigation instead revealed a more complicated picture, one in which multiple circumstances surrounded Whitman's actions without removing his responsibility for the deaths. Another important fact was that Whitman would never face a criminal trial. He had been killed by police at the end of the attack. There would be no courtroom examination of his motives. No jury would hear his testimony. There would be no cross-examination of Whitman himself and no opportunity for a conventional criminal prosecution to establish a verdict. The investigation, therefore, became the primary means through which the public could learn what had happened. Evidence had to speak in his absence. His notes became part of that evidence. The circumstances of the deaths became part of it. His preparations and the supplies found with him became part of it. His background became part of it. The testimony and observations of people who had known him became part of the attempt to understand the person behind the violence. Yet there remained a limit to what an investigation could accomplish. It could reconstruct actions. It could establish a timeline. It could identify victims. It could document weapons and supplies. It could examine psychological and medical evidence. But it could not restore the people who had died. It could not return Margaret to her family. It could not return Kathy to the life she had shared with her husband. It could not erase the injuries suffered by 31 people. And it could not answer every question about why Whitman chose to transform his private crisis into public violence. That uncertainty became one of the lasting features of the case. The investigation showed that Whitman's actions had developed through a sequence of decisions. His psychological difficulties were real, his personal problems were documented, and the tumor found after his death was medically significant enough to provoke discussion. But none of those facts provided a complete explanation for the massacre. What investigators could establish was the path. It began with a troubled period in Whitman's life. It moved through his relationship with his mother and wife. It continued with their deaths. It proceeded through the collection of weapons and supplies, and his journey to the University of Texas Tower. It culminated in approximately 96 minutes of gunfire and ended when Martinez and McCoy reached him. The tower had been the visible center of the tragedy. The evidence showed that the story had started somewhere else. As investigators pieced together that story, the case became more than an account of a shooting from a university tower. It became an examination of a man whose final actions had destroyed 17 lives in total and wounded many others, while leaving behind questions about psychology, responsibility, and prevention that could not be settled by the evidence alone. The most important conclusion remained painfully simple. Whatever explanation might be offered for Whitman's state of mind, the victims had no role in creating the violence that killed or wounded them. They were people caught in an attack they could neither anticipate nor control. And once the investigation had established the basic sequence of events, attention could turn toward the questions that remained. What could be learned from Whitman's final writings? What significance could be assigned to the tumor found in his brain? And how would the aftermath of the massacre shape the way the case was remembered? Those questions would keep the story alive long after the tower had fallen silent. The events of August 1, 1966, did not lead to a conventional criminal trial. Charles Whitman was dead before investigators could question him in court, before a jury could ever be asked to decide his guilt. The officers who reached the observation level of the University of Texas Tower had ended the attack by shooting him at approximately 1:24 in the afternoon. As a result, the The fifth stage of the case was fundamentally different from the usual story of a murder investigation. There would be no verdict delivered by a jury. Instead, the investigation itself became the principal means of reconstructing what Whitman had done and why the events had unfolded. The basic sequence was difficult to dispute. Before the public attack, Whitman had gone to his mother's apartment and killed Margaret Elizabeth Whitman. He then returned to the home he shared with his wife, Catherine Kathy Leisner Whitman, and killed her. After these deaths, he prepared himself for the next stage by gathering weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies. He then went to the University of Texas Tower. From the tower, he opened fire at approximately 11:48 in the morning. For roughly 96 minutes, he continued shooting at people below and in the surrounding area. He fired approximately 150 rounds. Police officers and armed civilians attempted to respond, while officers inside the building worked toward the observation level. Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy eventually reached Whitman's position. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, they shot him, ending the attack. The evidence gathered afterward made the distinction between accident and deliberate action especially important. Whitman had not simply stumbled into the tower carrying a weapon. He had prepared himself. The presence of food and water, together with weapons and ammunition, indicated that he had anticipated remaining there for some period of time. His actions before reaching the university also demonstrated that the violence had already begun elsewhere. The notes Whitman left behind became another important part of the investigation. They described his feelings toward his mother and wife and expressed that he loved them. At the same time, the notes described psychological difficulties, anger, and disturbing thoughts that he did not fully understand. Those writings did not provide a complete explanation, but they gave investigators material with which to reconstruct his state of mind during the period before the killings. The contradiction was difficult to escape. Whitman had written about love for two people he had killed. He had also described internal problems that had troubled him. His writings therefore raised questions rather than resolving them. They could show what he had been thinking or what he wanted others to understand, but they could not establish a single cause for his actions. His earlier life was examined as part of that same effort. Whitman had served in the United States Marine Corps and had received firearms training. He later attended the University of Texas and married Kathy. During the months before the massacre, he experienced difficulties involving his studies, finances, marriage, and relationship with his father. People who knew him described changes in his mood and behavior. He had also sought psychological assistance and had acknowledged disturbing thoughts and episodes of anger. These facts were relevant because they showed that Whitman's final actions occurred against a background of increasing personal instability. But they did not create a legal trial or produce a definitive explanation. There was no opportunity for Whitman to answer questions from investigators under oath, and there was no defense attorney presenting a case on his behalf. The public, therefore, had to rely on the evidence left behind and on the accounts of those who had encountered him. The most significant medical discovery came after Whitman's death. During the autopsy, doctors found a brain tumor identified as an astrocytoma. The finding immediately became important because it raised questions about whether a physical condition in Whitman's brain might have influenced his emotions or behavior. The possibility that the tumor had affected Whitman's behavior became a subject of continuing discussion, but the available information did not establish that the tumor directly caused the massacre. It could be considered as one factor among several, but it could not automatically explain the decisions Whitman had made. His personal difficulties, psychological complaints, family relationships, preparation, and deliberate movement to the tower also remained part of the evidence. That distinction is essential. A medical discovery can help researchers ask better questions without providing a complete answer. In Whitman's case, the tumor became one of the most debated elements surrounding his death, but it did not change the basic facts of the massacre. 17 people ultimately died when the later death of a wounded victim in 2001 was included, and 31 people were wounded. 16 deaths occurred in the immediate aftermath of the attack, including Whitman's mother and wife, while another victim later died from complications associated with the injuries. There was therefore no conventional legal judgment to deliver. Whitman could not be sentenced because he was already dead. The outcome was established at the scene of the attack itself. The gunman was killed, the shooting stopped, and the investigation documented the consequences. For the victims' families, this outcome could not resemble the closure that a trial sometimes provides. There would be no moment when Whitman stood before a judge and heard a sentence. There would be no opportunity to hear him answer questions about his actions in open court. There would be no cross-examination that might test his explanations. His death ended the immediate danger, but it also ended the possibility of obtaining direct answers from him. Margaret Elizabeth Whitman and Kathy Whitman had been killed before the public knew that an attack was coming. The other victims had been caught in the university's shooting without warning. 31 people survived their wounds, but survival did not mean that August 1st ended when the gunfire stopped. The consequences continued beyond the tower, beyond the investigation, and beyond the day itself. For investigators, the absence of a trial meant that the reconstruction of events had to carry much of the burden normally shared by a courtroom. The timeline had to be clear. The evidence had to be documented. Whitman's writings had to be examined carefully. His background had to be considered without turning speculation into fact. The tumor had to be recognized as a significant discovery without being treated as a proven explanation. The result was a case defined by certainty in some areas and uncertainty in others. There was certainty about the sequence of the killings. There was certainty that Whitman had prepared weapons and supplies. There was certainty that he had fired from the tower for approximately 96 minutes. There was certainty that Martinez and McCoy reached him and shot him. There was certainty about the number of deaths and injuries recorded after the massacre. His notes revealed distress, but distress did not explain everything. His personal problems provided context, but context did not establish a single motive. The tumor offered a possible medical factor, but it did not provide a universally accepted cause. His military background explained his firearms training, but it did not explain why he chose to use that training against civilians. The story could easily be reduced to the image of a gunman on a tower. But the evidence showed something broader, a sequence that began with private family violence, moved through preparation, and culminated in a public attack. The tower was the most visible part of the tragedy, but it was not the beginning. There was also no conventional result in the courtroom sense. Whitman's death was the final outcome of the confrontation. The legal system never had the opportunity to prosecute him, and no sentence could be imposed. What remained was the historical record and the questions created by the evidence. In that sense, the absence of a trial became part of the tragedy itself. A courtroom might have provided an opportunity to test explanations, examine motives, and hear testimony. Instead, investigators and the public were left to interpret documents, physical evidence, personal history, and medical findings after the person responsible was already dead. The case therefore ended without a traditional verdict, but not without consequences. The investigation documented what happened. The evidence established the sequence. The victims' deaths became part of the historical record. The wounded survivors carried the effects of the attack forward. And the discovery of Whitman's brain tumor ensured that questions about his mental state would continue long after the investigation was finished. Yet no explanation could alter the central fact of the case. Whatever combination of personal, psychological, and medical circumstances surrounded Charles Whitman, the people below the tower had not chosen any of them. They were simply living their lives when the violence reached them. The final judgment of history would therefore remain divided between what could be proven and what could only be questioned. The facts of the attack were clear. The reasons behind it were far less certain. And after the police investigation ended, another story began. The story of what the massacre left behind for Austin, for the University of Texas, for the surviving victims, and for the families who had lost someone on August 1st, 1966. When the gunfire from the University of Texas Tower finally stopped on August 1st, 1966, Austin did not simply return to normal. The immediate threat had ended, but the consequences of the attack had only begun. People who had started the day expecting an ordinary summer morning were now confronting death, serious injuries, confusion, and the knowledge that a familiar landmark had become the center of a devastating act of violence. The tower remained standing, but its meaning had changed. For the people who had witnessed the attack, it could no longer be viewed simply as part of the university landscape. For families who lost someone, August 1st would never again be an ordinary date. For survivors, the experience became part of their lives long after Whitman was dead. And for investigators and researchers, the case became an enduring subject of questions about violence, psychological distress, responsibility, and the limits of what can be known about another person's mind. The immediate human cost was enormous. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, including Whitman's mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, and his wife, Catherine "Kathy" Whitman. 31 people were wounded. One of the wounded victims later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total number of deaths connected to the attack to 17. Those numbers became part of the historical record, but the meaning of the tragedy cannot be contained in statistics. Every person who died represented a life that had existed before the morning of August 1st. Every wounded survivor carried an experience that could not simply disappear when the shooting ended. Every family affected by the attack had to continue living with an absence that could not be repaired. For Margaret and Kathy, the circumstances were especially painful because their deaths occurred before the public attack. They were not among the strangers who happened to be crossing the university grounds when Whitman began firing. They were members of his immediate family, killed in private before he carried his violence into the public space of the university. That sequence made the case particularly disturbing. The massacre was not an isolated moment that appeared without warning. It followed a series of actions that began with the deaths of people closest to Whitman. He then gathered weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies before going to the tower. The public attack was therefore the final stage of a sequence that had already destroyed his own family. For the wider Austin community, the event created a profound sense of shock. The University of Texas was a place associated with education, students, daily routines, and ordinary human interaction. The tower was a familiar feature of that environment. On August 1st, it became the source of danger rather than a symbol of the university itself. The fact that the attack lasted approximately 96 minutes made the experience even more difficult to comprehend. For more than an hour, people knew that the gunman remained above them. Police officers had to find a way to reach him, while civilians searched for safety. Some armed civilians attempted to help confront Whitman from the ground. Others focused entirely on escaping or assisting the wounded. The eventual actions of Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy became a defining part of the story. They reached the observation level and confronted Whitman, shooting him at approximately 1:24 in the afternoon. Their actions ended the immediate threat. But stopping the shooter did not stop the suffering. For the injured, the consequences extended beyond the moment of rescue. 31 people survived wounds sustained during the attack. One later died from complications associated with those injuries in 2001. The long-term significance of survival is often overlooked when historical events are reduced to casualty figures. A person who survives a violent attack does not necessarily leave the event behind when the emergency ends. The same is true for families. The death of a loved one changes the shape of a family permanently. The people left behind must continue with the absence created by the loss. In the case of the Whitman victims, those losses were connected to an event that became nationally remembered, meaning that the date and circumstances could never be separated from public history. The aftermath also created a difficult question about Charles Whitman's state of mind. During the investigation, authorities examined the notes he had left behind. Those writings described his love for his mother and wife while also describing psychological difficulties, anger, and disturbing thoughts. Whitman had previously sought psychological assistance, suggesting that he was aware that something was wrong. After his death, the autopsy revealed another significant fact. Whitman had an astrocytoma, a brain tumor. The discovery immediately raised questions about whether the tumor might have influenced his behavior. This question has remained controversial because the tumor cannot be treated as a simple explanation for the massacre. There was no universal agreement that it directly caused Whitman's actions. The evidence instead points toward a complicated picture involving psychological complaints, personal problems, family tensions, and deliberate preparation. It is important to preserve that distinction. Mental or physical illness cannot automatically be equated with violence. Nor can the existence of a medical condition erase the reality of deliberate actions. In Whitman's case, the tumor became one factor that researchers considered while trying to understand his behavior, but it did not provide a complete answer. The case also demonstrates the limits of retrospective explanation. After a tragedy, there is a natural desire to find one cause. People want a single event, diagnosis, conflict, or discovery that can explain everything. But human behavior is rarely so simple. Whitman's life included military service, education, marriage, family tensions, financial and academic problems, psychological distress, and a medical condition discovered after his death. These facts can be placed beside one another, but they do not automatically form a complete explanation. What can be established with greater certainty is what Whitman did. He killed his mother. He killed his wife. He gathered weapons and supplies. He went to the University of Texas Tower. He opened fire on people below. He continued the attack for approximately 96 minutes. He fired approximately 150 rounds. He was eventually confronted by Martinez and McCoy and killed. Those facts do not depend on speculation about what Whitman might have been thinking. The uncertainty begins when investigators attempt to answer why. That distinction is especially important when remembering the victims. The story should not allow the killer's psychological state to overshadow the people whose lives were destroyed. Whitman's name became widely known because of what he did, but the victims were not supporting characters in his story. They were the people who suffered the consequences of his decisions. Their lives existed independently of him. That is perhaps the most important perspective to preserve when looking back at the massacre. A true account of August 1st, 1966, should not transform Whitman into a mysterious or fascinating figure whose identity becomes more important than the people he killed. The evidence can be examined, his background can be studied, and the unanswered questions can be acknowledged without turning the perpetrator into the center of admiration or fascination. The tower itself provides a powerful symbol for that distinction. Whitman occupied the highest position in the physical scene, but the historical meaning of the tragedy belongs to the people affected by his actions. The victims and survivors are the reason the event matters. The families who lost loved ones are part of its lasting human reality. The wounded survivors represent the consequences that continued after the shooting stopped. There was also an important absence in the aftermath. Whitman could not be brought to trial. He had already been killed by police, so there was no courtroom where his motives could be examined under questioning, no jury that could deliver a verdict, and no sentence that could formally punish him. The investigation, therefore, became the primary method of reconstructing the events. That absence left some questions permanently unresolved. Perhaps the most enduring question is whether anything could have been done before August 1st to prevent the violence. Whitman had experienced psychological difficulties. He had sought help. He had described troubling thoughts and anger. Yet the available information does not provide a simple answer about whether the tragedy could have been prevented. That uncertainty should not be mistaken for evidence that the outcome was inevitable. It simply means that history cannot rewrite the decisions that were made or the information available at the time. The massacre remains a reminder that warning signs, personal crises, and violent intentions can exist within complicated human circumstances. It also demonstrates how quickly ordinary life can be transformed when a person decides to direct violence toward others. But the most lasting lesson is not about the height of the tower, the number of rounds fired, or the details of Whitman's preparations. It is about the people who were there. They went to a university campus, walked along streets, traveled through Austin, and expected to return to their ordinary lives. Some never did. Others survived, but carried the memory of that morning forward. Their families inherited grief that did not end when the police reached the observation level. More than half a century later, the basic facts remain unchanged. Charles Whitman died on August 1st, 1966, after carrying out an attack that killed 16 people immediately and ultimately 17 when a wounded victim later died from related complications. 31 people were wounded. His mother and wife had already been killed. His notes and the discovery of a brain tumor left investigators and researchers with questions about his state of mind, but no single explanation has erased the complexity of the case. The University of Texas Tower survived. Austin survived. The victims' families continued living with their losses. And the case remained in American history not because the killer deserved to be remembered, but because the lives affected by his actions deserved not to be forgotten. In the end, the most responsible way to remember August 1st, 1966, is to resist the temptation to turn tragedy into mythology. The facts are powerful enough without embellishment. A troubled man made a series of deliberate choices. Those choices caused irreversible suffering. Police officers eventually stopped him. Investigators reconstructed what they could. Questions remained where the evidence could not provide certainty. And behind every number was a human life. That is where the story should finally rest. Not on the tower, not on the weapons, and not on the mystery surrounding Whitman's mind, but on the ordinary people whose lives were changed forever on a summer day in Austin. Their memory is the part of this story that should remain. The story of August 1st, 1966, did not end when the last shot was fired from the University of Texas Tower. The immediate violence ended when Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy reached Charles Whitman's position and shot him at approximately 1:24 in the afternoon. But the meaning of what had happened was only beginning to take shape. In the hours and days that followed, Austin had to confront the reality that a familiar university landmark had become the setting for a mass shooting, while investigators worked backward through the evidence to understand how Whitman had reached that point. The first task was to establish the human cost. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, including Whitman's mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, and his wife, Catherine Kathy Whitman. 31 people were wounded. One wounded victim later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total number of deaths connected to the attack to 17. Those figures describe the scale of the tragedy, but they cannot describe the individuality of the people affected. Each victim had a life that existed before Whitman's actions entered it. The people on the university grounds had been students, pedestrians, drivers, and members of an ordinary community. They had not chosen to become part of a historical event. They simply happened to be present when gunfire began from above. The same is true of the survivors. 31 people lived through injuries that day, but survival did not mean that the event became insignificant once the emergency ended. The shooting lasted approximately 96 minutes, creating a prolonged period of uncertainty in which people did not know when the danger would stop. Some searched for protection. Some tried to help others. Some attempted to escape exposed areas. Police officers and armed civilians tried to confront the shooter while the attack continued. For Austin, the experience changed the meaning of the university tower. A structure associated with education and the daily life of the campus had become associated with violence. The physical tower remained, but the memory attached to it had changed permanently. The location could no longer be separated from the morning, when people below were forced to look upward and realize that someone was firing upon them. The investigation also revealed that the public attack was only one part of a larger sequence. Whitman had killed his mother before going to the university. He had then killed his wife. After those deaths, he gathered weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies, and went to the tower. This sequence matters because it challenges the idea that the massacre was a single unexplained explosion of violence. The available evidence shows preparation. Whitman had time to move from one stage to another. He had written notes. He had collected supplies. He had selected the tower. He had entered the university and reached an elevated position before opening fire. Yet preparation does not answer the question of motive. That question remained difficult because Whitman left behind evidence of psychological distress without leaving behind an explanation that could account for everything. His notes expressed affection for his mother and wife while also describing anger, troubling thoughts, and psychological difficulties that he did not fully understand. He had previously sought psychological assistance. These details created a complicated picture. Whitman appeared to recognize that something was wrong with him, but recognition did not prevent the killings. His personal difficulties included problems with his studies, finances, marriage, and relationship with his father. People who knew him described changes in his mood and behavior. He had also served in the United States Marine Corps and had received firearms training. None of these facts, individually, provides a complete explanation. His military background explains that he had firearms training, but it does not explain why he chose to use weapons against civilians. His personal problems provide context, but personal difficulties are not an excuse for murder. His psychological complaints show distress, but they do not establish that mental illness directly caused the attack. The discovery made during his autopsy introduced another question. Doctors found an astrocytoma, a brain tumor, in Whitman's brain. The discovery attracted attention because people wanted to know whether the tumor might have influenced his behavior. But the tumor did not provide a simple answer. There was no universal agreement that it directly caused the massacre. It became a subject of medical and psychological discussion, but it had to be considered alongside everything else known about Whitman. The existence of a tumor did not erase the sequence of deliberate actions that had preceded the shooting. This distinction is important when reflecting on the case. After a tragedy, there is often a desire to find one explanation that can make an incomprehensible event easier to understand. But the evidence surrounding Whitman does not support such a simple conclusion. There were personal pressures, psychological difficulties, family tensions, preparations, and a medical discovery. They form the background of the case, but they do not produce one universally accepted answer. There was also no courtroom in which those questions could be tested. Whitman was killed before he could be arrested and prosecuted. As a result, there was no conventional trial, no jury verdict, and no sentence. Investigators had to reconstruct the case without the participation of the person responsible for the violence. That absence shaped the historical record. A trial might have created an opportunity for testimony, questioning, and competing interpretations. Instead, the evidence had to be gathered from Whitman's notes, the circumstances surrounding the killings, the weapons and supplies he had carried, the observations of people who knew him, and the medical findings from his autopsy. The investigators could establish what happened with considerable clarity. They could establish the sequence of the deaths. They could establish that Whitman went to the tower prepared with weapons and supplies. They could establish that he fired approximately 150 rounds over roughly 96 minutes. They could establish that Martinez and McCoy ultimately reached him and ended the attack. What they could not establish with the same certainty was why he made those choices. That difference between facts and unanswered questions is one of the most important elements of the case. The victims did not need a perfect explanation for their suffering to be real. Their deaths were real. Their injuries were real. Their families' losses were real. The uncertainty surrounding Whitman's mind did not change those facts. The passage of time also did not remove the human consequences. For families, grief is not measured by the length of an investigation. For survivors, the end of the shooting does not necessarily represent the end of the experience. And for a community, a traumatic event can become part of its collective memory even after ordinary life resumes. Austin eventually moved forward as communities must. Students returned to the university. Streets became ordinary streets again. The tower remained part of the physical landscape. But the historical memory of August 1st could not be erased. The case also became an enduring example of the difficulty of responding to a gunman positioned above a crowded public area. During the attack, police officers and armed civilians had to improvise under dangerous conditions. The shooter was difficult to reach because of the height and structure of the tower. Those circumstances contributed to the length of the confrontation. Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy became central figures in the ending of the event because they were the officers who reached Whitman and stopped him. Their actions formed the final stage of the incident, but they could not undo what had already happened. The aftermath, therefore, contains two separate realities. One is the reality of the response. The shooter was stopped, the victims were treated or accounted for, and the immediate danger ended. The other is the reality of the consequences. People had died, people had been wounded, and families had been permanently changed. The second reality lasted much longer. It is also important to remember that the 17 deaths commonly associated with the case were not all recorded on the same day. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath, while another victim survived the initial attack and later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries. This later death demonstrates how the consequences of a violent event can extend across decades. Its consequences continued through families, survivors, collective memory, and history for generations afterward. The deeper investigators looked into the events surrounding August 1st, 1966, the more clearly they could see that the shooting from the University of Texas Tower was connected to a chain of events that had begun before Whitman entered the campus. The tower was where the violence became public, but it was not where the story started. The investigation had to move backward, from the gunfire and the final confrontation to the private decisions that had preceded them. One of the most important discoveries was the evidence that Whitman had prepared himself before reaching the tower. He carried weapons and ammunition, but he also brought food, water, and other supplies. Those preparations suggested that he had expected the situation to continue for some time. The presence of these supplies made it difficult to view the attack as something that happened without planning. Whatever was happening inside Whitman's mind, his actions showed a sequence of decisions. His mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, had been killed first. Whitman had gone to her apartment on the night of July 31st and murdered her. He then returned to the home he shared with his wife, Kathy Leisner Whitman, and killed her as well. Only after these private killings did he move toward the public attack. This sequence gave the investigation a disturbing structure. The violence began inside his family and then expanded outward. Whitman's notes became especially important because they provided information about his thoughts during this period. He wrote that he loved his mother and wife, yet both women were dead by his hand. He also described psychological difficulties, anger, and disturbing thoughts that he did not fully understand. The notes did not provide a simple motive, but they offered investigators a direct record of how Whitman described his own condition before the killings. Investigators also considered Whitman's earlier life. He had been born in Lake Worth, Florida, in 1941. His childhood had taken place in a family environment described as demanding and pressured. His father was strict, and the relationship between father and son later became increasingly strained. Whitman eventually joined the United States Marine Corps, where he received firearms training. After leaving the military, he attended the University of Texas and married Kathy. From the outside, none of these details alone predicted the massacre. Whitman was a student and husband who had experienced ordinary parts of adult life. Yet in the months before August 1st, difficulties had accumulated. He faced problems with his studies and finances. His marriage was under strain. His relationship with his father had deteriorated. People who knew him described changes in his mood and behavior. That fact became part of the effort to understand the warning signs that existed before the massacre. Whitman had recognized that he was experiencing disturbing thoughts and episodes of anger. He had attempted to seek help, but whatever assistance he received did not prevent the sequence that followed. It is important, however, not to turn those facts into a simple story in which psychological distress automatically leads to violence. The evidence does not support such a conclusion. Whitman's difficulties were part of the background, but they do not explain every decision he made. His actions still involved preparation, movement, and choices that caused irreversible harm. Whitman entered the University of Texas carrying his equipment. He used the elevator to reach the upper level and moved into the observation area. From that position, he had a broad view over the campus and nearby streets. The height of the tower made him difficult to reach and allowed him to fire over a wide area. For the people below, there was almost no time to understand what was happening. Some initially did not recognize the sound. Then people realized that the shots were coming from the tower. Students and pedestrians began looking for cover. Some dropped to the ground. Others ran. People attempted to help those who had been wounded, while police officers tried to identify the shooter's exact position and find a way to reach him. During that time, Whitman fired approximately 150 rounds. The length of the assault meant that the danger remained present for a prolonged period. The people below did not know when the shooting would end. Police officers faced the difficult task of approaching a gunman who occupied a high, protected position. Some armed civilians also attempted to return fire from the ground. The response was therefore shaped by uncertainty. The officers did not know exactly where Whitman was positioned, how much ammunition remained, or how long the attack might continue. The people outside had even less information. They could only react to what they could see and hear. Their arrival represented the decisive moment in the incident. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, they confronted Whitman and shot him. The gunfire stopped. Police found the supplies Whitman had brought with him, reinforcing the conclusion that he had prepared for the attack. They also examined his notes and reconstructed the deaths of his mother and wife. The evidence connected the private killings to the public shooting and established a sequence that began before the first shot at the university. During the autopsy, doctors found an astrocytoma, a brain tumor. The discovery immediately raised questions about whether the tumor might have influenced Whitman's emotional state or behavior. Because the tumor was located in his brain, some observers wondered whether it could have contributed to the changes people had noticed before the killings. There was no universal agreement that the tumor directly caused Whitman's actions. It was a significant medical finding, but it had to be considered alongside his personal problems, psychological difficulties, family tensions, and deliberate preparation. Reducing the massacre to the tumor would have gone beyond what the evidence could establish. Whitman had experienced anger and troubling thoughts. He had sought help. He had described problems in his own writing. These details suggested that he had been struggling, but they did not establish a single cause for the violence. It established the sequence of events. It established that Whitman had killed his mother and wife before going to the university. It established that he had prepared weapons and supplies. It established that he had fired for approximately 96 minutes and that he was eventually killed by police. That uncertainty became especially important because there would be no criminal trial. Whitman had died at the scene, so he could not be questioned in court. There would be no jury verdict and no sentence. The evidence had to speak in his absence. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, including Margaret and Kathy. 31 people were wounded. One wounded victim later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total to 17 deaths. The numbers marked the scale of the tragedy, but the investigation was ultimately about individuals. The victims had been living ordinary lives before the attack. They had not chosen to enter Whitman's story. They became part of it only because he decided to direct violence toward them. The case can be studied through its weapons, its timeline, its medical evidence, and its unanswered questions, but none of those elements should obscure the people who suffered. The purpose of reconstructing Whitman's final hours is not to make his actions more fascinating. It is to understand the sequence accurately and to recognize how a private crisis became a public catastrophe. By the end of the investigation, the central facts were clear enough. Whitman had moved from personal violence to public violence. He had prepared for the attack. He had selected a position that made him difficult to reach. He had continued firing until police officers reached him. What remained uncertain was the interior world that had driven those choices. What they do reveal is a progression. A family was destroyed before the public knew there was danger. Weapons and supplies were gathered. A university tower was entered. Gunfire followed. Police responded. Victims died, and others were wounded. Whitman was killed. Investigators reconstructed the sequence. And after the reconstruction came the question that history could not completely answer, whether the signs visible before August 1st could ever have been recognized as the beginning of something so terrible. That question would remain long after the investigation ended, because the final lesson of the case was not contained in one note, one medical discovery, or one moment in the tower. It existed in the entire sequence of events, and in the lives that could never return to what they had been before that morning, even today. As the investigation into Charles Whitman's actions continued, the case gradually moved beyond the immediate facts of the shooting and toward a more difficult territory, the questions that could not be answered with certainty. Investigators could reconstruct what Whitman had done. They could establish the sequence of the killings, identify the preparations he had made, and document the attack from the University of Texas Tower. But understanding why he had chosen to carry out those actions was far more complicated. The evidence showed that the violence had begun before August 1st became a public tragedy. On the night of July 31st, Whitman killed his mother, Margaret Elizabeth Whitman. He then returned to the home he shared with his wife, Catherine Kathy Leisner Whitman, and killed her. Afterward, he prepared himself for the next stage of his actions by gathering weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies. That sequence was important because it demonstrated that the attack involved preparation. Whitman had not simply arrived at the university without a plan and suddenly begun shooting. He had already committed 2 murders. He had collected the equipment he needed. He had then entered the university and traveled to the tower. The evidence therefore established a progression, but it did not establish a complete motive. Whitman's notes became one of the most revealing pieces of evidence concerning his state of mind. In those writings, he expressed love for his mother and wife while also describing disturbing thoughts, anger, and psychological difficulties. The contrast was difficult to understand. How could someone describe love for people he had deliberately killed? The notes could not resolve that contradiction. They showed that Whitman was experiencing thoughts and emotions that troubled him, but they could not demonstrate exactly how those feelings developed into murder. They could provide a glimpse into his thinking, but they could not offer a complete explanation for the decisions he made. His earlier history provided additional context. Whitman had been born in Lake Worth, Florida, in 1941. His childhood had taken place within a demanding family environment. His father was described as strict, and their relationship later became increasingly strained. Whitman eventually joined the United States Marine Corps, where he received firearms training. After leaving the military, he attended the University of Texas and married Kathy. During the period before the massacre, however, several parts of his life became increasingly difficult. He experienced academic and financial problems. His marriage faced difficulties. His relationship with his father deteriorated. People who knew him later described changes in his mood and behavior. Perhaps most significant was the fact that Whitman had sought psychological assistance. This meant that his internal difficulties were not completely unknown to him. He had experienced anger and thoughts that he found disturbing. He had recognized that something was happening inside him that he did not fully understand. Yet recognizing a problem and preventing violence are not the same thing. The case therefore raises a difficult question about warning signs. Could the people around Whitman have understood the seriousness of what he was experiencing? Could his psychological difficulties have been interpreted differently? Could anything have changed the sequence of events that followed? The available information does not provide a definite answer. It would be easy, looking backward, to connect every unusual behavior to the massacre. But hindsight can create a misleading sense of inevitability. Many people experience personal crises, anger, financial problems, family conflict, or psychological distress without ever committing violence. The existence of these circumstances does not mean that a massacre was destined to happen. Whitman's actions have to be judged by what he actually did rather than by assumptions about what his difficulties supposedly made inevitable. Another major question emerged from the medical evidence. After Whitman's death, doctors discovered an astrocytoma, a brain tumor. Because the tumor was located in his brain, it immediately attracted attention from people trying to understand his behavior. The possibility that the tumor might have affected his emotions or ability to control his behavior became an important subject of discussion. But the tumor could not provide a definitive explanation. There was no universal agreement that it directly caused Whitman's violence. It was a medical finding that could be considered alongside other evidence, not a proven explanation that erased everything else. His psychological complaints, personal problems, family tensions, and deliberate preparations remained part of the picture. That distinction became increasingly important as the case entered historical memory. A complicated event often creates a desire for a simple explanation. People naturally want to believe that an incomprehensible act must have a single identifiable cause. If a medical condition can be found, it may appear to provide an answer. If a family conflict can be identified, that may seem sufficient. If psychological distress is documented, it can become tempting to treat it as the entire explanation. But the evidence surrounding Whitman does not justify reducing the massacre to any one factor. The tumor did not explain the preparations. His academic difficulties did not explain the killings of his mother and wife. His relationship with his father did not explain the decision to attack people at the university. His psychological distress did not automatically transform into a plan to shoot strangers. The evidence instead shows several circumstances surrounding a sequence of deliberate actions. Another unanswered question concerned the scale of the preparations. Whitman carried enough equipment to suggest that he expected the situation to last. Food and water indicated that he was prepared to remain in the tower. Weapons and ammunition allowed him to continue firing. The tower itself gave him an elevated position from which he could see the campus and surrounding streets. These facts helped investigators understand the mechanics of the attack, but they also demonstrated the degree to which Whitman's actions had moved beyond an immediate emotional reaction. By approximately 11:48 in the morning, the first shots were fired. For approximately 96 minutes, the people below lived through an attack that was difficult to comprehend. Students, pedestrians, and others in the surrounding area became potential targets. People searched for cover. Others attempted to assist the wounded. Police officers worked to locate Whitman and find a way to reach him. Some armed civilians also attempted to respond from the ground. The elevated position made the situation exceptionally difficult. The tower protected Whitman from immediate access, while the people below had limited ability to determine his exact position. The response therefore required officers to move toward the danger rather than simply wait for it to end. Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy eventually reached the observation level. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, they confronted Whitman and shot him. The attack ended, but the investigation continued. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath, including Whitman's mother and wife. 31 people were wounded. A wounded victim later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries, bringing the commonly cited total number of deaths connected with the case to 17. There was no trial. Whitman was dead, so there was no opportunity for prosecutors to present the case before a jury. There was no defense testimony from Whitman himself. There was no sentence. The investigation had to provide the reconstruction that a courtroom might otherwise have produced. This absence left the case with a particular kind of uncertainty. The facts of the attack were established, but the ultimate motive remained difficult to define. Investigators could study Whitman's notes, his background, his preparations, and his medical condition. They could examine the sequence of events and determine what happened. But they could not enter his mind. Even Whitman's own writings could not fully solve that problem. A person's explanation of his own thoughts is evidence, but it is not necessarily a complete map of those thoughts. Whitman's notes showed distress and contradiction. They did not make his decisions understandable in any simple way. This became one of the most enduring features of the case. The investigation could answer how. It could answer when. It could answer where. It could identify who was killed and who was wounded. But the question of why remained partly beyond reach. That uncertainty should not be confused with a lack of evidence about responsibility. The absence of a complete psychological explanation does not make the actions themselves uncertain. Whitman had killed his mother and wife. He had gone to the university with weapons and supplies. He had opened fire from the tower. He had continued shooting until police officers reached him. The evidence was clear about those actions. What remained unclear was the inner process that led him toward them. For the families of the victims, that distinction could never make the losses easier. A better understanding of Whitman's mind could not return the people who had died. A medical theory could not reverse the injuries. A reconstructed timeline could not restore the ordinary lives that had existed before August 1, 1966. The investigation could explain the tragedy without undoing it. That is perhaps the most difficult lesson in the case. There are moments when history gives us enough evidence to reconstruct an event, but not enough evidence to completely understand it. The Whitman case belongs to that category. It contains a clear chain of actions surrounded by questions about psychology, personal crisis, and medical evidence. The unanswered questions have remained because the person who could potentially have provided direct answers died at the end of the attack. What investigators were left with was evidence. What the public was left with was a story. And what the victims' families were left with was loss. More than half a century later, the facts remain stark. A man experiencing serious personal and psychological difficulties killed 2 members of his own family, prepared himself for a larger attack, and opened fire from the University of Texas Tower. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath, 31 were wounded, and another victim later died from complications associated with the injuries. The case remains significant not because every question has been solved, but because some questions resist easy answers. The tower explains where the public tragedy unfolded. The evidence explains how it happened. Whitman's history provides context. His notes provide a glimpse into his troubled state of mind. The tumor provides another unresolved medical question. But none of these elements alone explains the whole story. And perhaps the most responsible way to remember the case is to accept that uncertainty without allowing it to overshadow what is certain. Ordinary people lost their lives. Survivors carried injuries and memories forward, and families were permanently changed by decisions they did not make. The next stage of the story is therefore not about searching endlessly for a perfect explanation. It is about understanding what the case left behind, how its victims and survivors became part of American history, and why the events of one August afternoon in Austin continued to matter long after the tower became quiet again. More than half a century after August 1st, 1966, the facts of the Charles Whitman case remain familiar, but familiarity can sometimes make a tragedy feel distant. The dates, numbers, locations, and names can become part of a historical record, repeated until they seem almost abstract. Yet behind those facts were people whose lives were interrupted without warning, families who lost someone they loved, and survivors whose lives continued after the gunfire stopped. That is why remembering the victims is essential. Whitman's name became attached to the University of Texas Tower because he was responsible for the violence that unfolded there. His background, his writings, his psychological difficulties, and the brain tumor discovered after his death have all been examined repeatedly. Those subjects may help explain parts of the case, but they should never become more important than the people who suffered because of his actions. The victims were not participants in his personal crisis. They were simply people who happened to be present. On the morning of August 1st, the university grounds and surrounding streets represented ordinary life. Students and other people moved through Austin as they normally would. Nothing about their daily routines suggested that the tower above them would soon become the center of a prolonged attack. Then, at approximately 11:48 in the morning, the first shots were fired. The suddenness of the violence created a situation in which people had to react before they fully understood what was happening. Some initially did not recognize the sound as gunfire. Once people realized that shots were coming from above, the ordinary environment changed immediately. People searched for places where they could escape exposure.
Some ran.
Others dropped to the ground. Some tried to help people who had been wounded. The attack continued for approximately 96 minutes. That length of time matters because it means the victims and witnesses were not confronted with a single brief moment of violence. The danger remained present. People had to live through a prolonged period in which they knew that the shooter was still above them. The tower's height created an additional difficulty. Whitman was positioned far above the people on the ground, with a broad view over the university and nearby streets. Police officers could not simply walk toward him from the outside. They had to find a way to reach the observation level while knowing that the gunman could continue firing. Some armed civilians also attempted to respond. Their presence reflected the confusion of the moment. The people below did not have the benefit of a prepared response plan that could instantly solve the situation. They had to react to circumstances that were developing around them. Police officers worked to identify the shooter's position, while others sought safety or attempted to assist the wounded. Eventually, Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy reached the area where Whitman was positioned. At approximately 1:24 in the afternoon, they shot him. The attack stopped. But for the victims, the consequences had already become permanent. 16 people died in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, including Margaret Elizabeth Whitman and Catherine Kathy Whitman, who had been killed before the public shooting began. 31 people were wounded. One of those wounded victims survived the initial attack, but later died in 2001 from complications associated with the injuries. For that reason, the commonly cited total number of deaths connected to the case is 17. The difference between 16 and 17 is important historically, but the number itself can never capture the full reality of a loss. A person is not simply a casualty figure. A family member is not merely an entry in an investigative report. A survivor is not simply a statistic describing someone who lived. The human consequences of the attack existed beyond the official accounting. For the families, the loss did not end when investigators completed their work. The death of a loved one changes the structure of everyday life. Familiar routines can become reminders of absence. Important dates can acquire new meanings. Memories remain connected to the person who is no longer there. In this case, those losses were also connected to a public event that became part of American history. The families could not simply separate their grief from the wider story because the event itself became widely remembered. For survivors, the situation was different, but no less significant. 31 people lived through the attack after being wounded. Their survival became part of the historical record, but survival should not be confused with escaping consequences. The fact that a person lived does not mean that the event had no lasting effect. The injuries themselves were real, and one victim eventually died decades later from complications associated with those wounds. The case therefore demonstrates how violence can continue to have consequences long after the person responsible is gone. Whitman died on the day of the attack. The victims did not receive that choice. Some died that day. Others survived. Families continued living with the consequences. The wounded carried the reality of what had happened forward. This is also why the absence of a trial matters. Whitman could not be prosecuted because he was killed by police. There was no courtroom in which the victims' families could hear him answer questions. There was no jury verdict. There was no sentence imposed by a judge. The investigation had to stand in place of that process. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events through physical evidence, Whitman's notes, information about his background, and the circumstances surrounding the attack. They established that the violence had begun with the deaths of his mother and wife. They established that Whitman had gathered weapons, ammunition, food, water, and other supplies before going to the tower. They established the duration and scale of the shooting and documented the eventual confrontation with police. But reconstruction could not provide everything. It could not explain every thought Whitman experienced before committing the murders. It could not establish with certainty whether the astrocytoma discovered during his autopsy had influenced his behavior. It could not determine whether the psychological assistance he had sought might have prevented the attack under different circumstances. These questions remain important, but they must be approached carefully. The discovery of the brain tumor created an understandable desire to search for a medical explanation. Yet there was no universal agreement that the tumor directly caused the massacre. The tumor was an important medical finding, but it was not a complete answer. Whitman's behavior also existed within a broader context of personal problems, psychological distress, family tensions, and deliberate preparation. That complexity matters because simple explanations can distort the historical record. If the entire tragedy is attributed to one medical condition, the many other facts disappear. If it is attributed entirely to personal conflict, the psychological evidence disappears. If it is described only as an act of sudden madness, the preparation disappears. The evidence shows something more complicated. Whitman had difficulties. He had sought psychological assistance. He had written about disturbing thoughts. He had experienced problems involving his studies, finances, marriage, and relationship with his father. He also deliberately killed 2 people, gathered weapons and supplies, traveled to the university, entered the tower, and opened fire. Those facts can exist together without producing a single simple explanation. Remembering the victims means keeping that complexity in perspective. The purpose of studying Whitman's background is not to make his story more compelling than theirs. It is to understand how the tragedy developed while keeping responsibility and human suffering at the center. The University of Texas Tower became the defining location of the event, but the tragedy cannot be reduced to a building. It happened to people. The tower did not suffer. The statistics did not suffer. The historical record did not suffer. People did. That distinction is easy to lose when an event becomes old enough to be studied in books and documentaries. Time can turn human tragedy into historical material. The names can become unfamiliar. The numbers can become memorized facts. The circumstances can be discussed without emotion because decades have passed. But the passage of time does not make the losses less real. For the people who were there, August 1st, 1966 was not history while it was happening. It was their present. It was the moment when an ordinary day became a life-threatening crisis. It was the moment when people ran, hid, helped one another, and waited for the shooting to stop. It was the moment when some families lost someone forever. And it was the beginning of memories that would remain long after the tower became quiet. The final confrontation between Martinez, McCoy, and Whitman ended the immediate threat, but it did not provide a complete ending to the story. There was no single moment when everyone affected could simply return to the lives they had known before. That is one of the defining characteristics of mass violence. The physical event can end quickly. The consequences can last for decades. In Whitman's case, those consequences were visible in the deaths, the injuries, the families, and the questions left behind. They were also reflected in the way the event entered the history of Austin and the University of Texas. The case became a reference point for discussions about violence from elevated positions, police response, psychological distress, and the difficult question of whether warning signs can ever be recognized before a tragedy occurs. But even these broader lessons should lead back to the people affected. The most important fact is not that the tower became famous. It is that people died there. The most important mystery is not what made Whitman notorious. It is how so many ordinary lives could be changed in such a short period. And the most lasting responsibility is not to preserve the reputation of the man who caused the violence, but to preserve the memory of those who endured it. August 1st, 1966 remains a date associated with tragedy, but remembrance does not have to mean fascination with the perpetrator. It can mean remembering the victims as individuals, recognizing the survivors, acknowledging the families who carried the losses forward, and refusing to let the passage of time turn suffering into a collection of numbers. The tower remains a physical landmark. The evidence remains part of history. The unanswered questions remain. But the people who were killed cannot speak for themselves. That is why the final chapters of this story must continue to place them at the center. Their lives existed before the shooting. Their families remembered them afterward. Their absence became permanent. And that, more than the mystery surrounding Charles Whitman's mind, is the legacy that should remain when the story of August 1st, 1966 is finally told.